Ruby loved the quiet of the old library nestled in the heart of her small town. The scent of aging paper and polished wooden floors always filled her with a sense of calm. For as long as she could remember, she had been coming here to escape the chaos of the outside world. Born blind, Ruby relied on her other senses to navigate life, and the library was her sanctuary, a place where she felt completely at ease. The Braille section, tucked away in a cozy corner, was her haven, and the staff knew her so well that they often set aside newly translated books for her to explore. That afternoon was no different. Ruby sat at her usual spot near the wide windows, where sunlight warmed her skin as she ran her fingers over the raised dots of a novel. She had learned to tune out the faint whispers of other visitors, the occasional rustle of pages, and the rhythmic sound of footsteps on the creaking floorboards. It was a symphony she had grown accustomed to over the years. But today something was different. She felt it before she heard it, a presence. It wasn't the soft shuffle of the librarian or the hurried steps of a student. This was something heavier, deliberate. The air seemed to shift, carrying with it a faint hum, almost like static electricity. Ruby paused, her fingers resting on the page. She tilted her head, listening intently. The footsteps drew closer, stopping a few feet away from her table. Whoever it was, they were large. She could hear the subtle creak of the wooden floor protesting under their weight. There was a faint metallic sound, like armor shifting, though it was almost imperceptible beneath the other noises. Ruby's pulse quickened. She didn't feel fear, exactly, but curiosity mixed with caution. "May I sit here?" A deep, resonant voice asked. It was unlike any voice she had ever heard, smooth yet carrying an undercurrent of something ancient, almost otherworldly. Ruby hesitated. Most people didn't approach her in the library. They knew she preferred solitude. But something about the voice intrigued her. "Sure," she replied, gesturing to the chair across from her. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor made her flinch slightly, and she felt the weight of the figure settle across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ruby felt the stranger's gaze on her, though she couldn't see it. She had learned to sense when someone was watching her, and this felt different. Not intrusive, but intense, as if the stranger were studying her, trying to understand something. "You like books," the voice finally said. It wasn't a question, but an observation. Ruby nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "They've always been my escape. They let me see the world in ways my eyes can't." She paused, running her fingers over the edge of her book. "What about you? Do you like books?" There was a long silence, and Ruby wondered if she had asked something inappropriate. Then the stranger spoke, his voice softer this time. "I don't know. I've never had the chance to explore them." Ruby's brow furrowed. "Never? That's hard to imagine. Libraries are everywhere. Not where I come from," the stranger replied, his tone carrying a hint of wistfulness. Ruby's curiosity grew. "Where are you from?" Another pause. "Far away," he said vaguely. "A place very different from this one." Ruby couldn't help but smile. "That's the most mysterious answer I've ever heard." The stranger chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Perhaps I'm not very good at small talk." She tilted her head. "You're doing fine so far. Do you have a name?" "Korak," he said after a moment, the syllables rolling off his tongue with a weight that made it sound significant, almost ceremonial. "Korak," Ruby repeated, tasting the unfamiliar name. "That's unique. I'm Ruby." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ruby," Korak said, his voice warm. There was an earnestness in his tone that surprised her. Most people she met were polite, but there was always a layer of discomfort or awkwardness when they realized she couldn't see them. Korak, however, seemed at ease, as if her blindness didn't faze him in the slightest. "What brings you to this little library, Korak?" she asked, curious about this enigmatic stranger. "I'm looking for something," he said carefully. "Or perhaps trying to avoid something." Ruby raised an eyebrow. "That's cryptic. Are you a spy or something?" To her surprise, Korak laughed a deep, genuine sound that filled the quiet space. No, not a spy. Just someone trying to stay out of trouble. His choice of words intrigued her, but she decided not to press. Everyone had their secrets, and she didn't want to overstep. Instead, she changed the subject. Well, if you've never had the chance to explore books, maybe I can recommend something. What are you interested in? There was a brief hesitation. Stories about resilience, he said finally. About facing impossible odds and finding strength. Ruby's smile widened. You've come to the right place. This library is full of those kinds of stories. As they continued talking, Ruby found herself drawn to Korak's voice and the way he listened so intently. He asked thoughtful questions about the books she read, her life, and even her perspective on the world. She noticed he avoided sharing too much about himself, but she didn't mind. There was something comforting about his presence, like an anchor in the storm. For Korak, the encounter was equally unexpected. He had spent so long hiding, constantly on the move, that he had forgotten what it felt like to have a genuine conversation. Ruby's blindness was a paradoxical blessing. She couldn't see the scars he bore, the faint glow of his alien physiology, or the faint shimmer of his battle-worn armor beneath the long coat he wore. Yet, she seemed to sense more about him than anyone else ever had. As the afternoon turned into evening, Ruby realized how much time had passed. I should probably head home, she said reluctantly. But it was nice talking to you, Korak. The pleasure was mine, Korak replied. He stood, the floor creaking under his weight. For a moment he hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Perhaps I'll see you here again? Ruby smiled. I'm here almost every day. You know where to find me. As Korak walked away, Ruby felt a strange mix of emotions: curiosity, warmth, and a nagging sense that there was more to him than he let on. She couldn't have known that her new acquaintance was far from ordinary, and their meeting would soon change both of their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. The weeks that followed brought an unusual rhythm to Ruby's life. Korak began visiting the library regularly, always at the same time and always heading straight to the table where Ruby sat. Their conversations became a comforting routine. Despite his enigmatic nature, Korak was easy to talk to. He listened with rapt attention as Ruby spoke about her favorite books, her life as a blind person, and the small joys she found in everyday moments. In return, he shared fragments of his own experiences, carefully chosen details that painted him as a traveler from a distant place, though he never revealed exactly where. Ruby found herself looking forward to his visits. She couldn't explain why, but there was something grounding about his presence. His deep voice carried a strange kind of weight, as if each word he spoke had been carefully considered. He had a way of making her feel seen in a way most people didn't, despite her inability to see him. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that Korak was holding something back. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, Ruby decided to confront the growing mystery of her unusual friend. Korak, she began, her tone light but probing, you always seem so interested in learning about me. But you never talk much about yourself. Why is that? There was a pause, long enough for her to wonder if she had overstepped. Finally, Korak spoke, his voice quieter than usual. There are parts of my life that are complicated. Sharing them might put you in danger, Ruby frowned. Danger? What kind of danger? Korak hesitated again, and Ruby could almost feel the internal battle he was waging. When he finally answered, his words were carefully measured. I've made enemies in my time. Powerful ones. It's safer if people don't know too much about me. Ruby tilted her head, her curiosity deepening. Enemies? Are you some kind of criminal? Korak's chuckle was low and humorless. It's not that simple. I've done things I'm not proud of, but I've also fought for what I believed was right. Sometimes those lines blur. His answer only raised more questions, but Ruby decided to tread carefully. Well, if you're worried about putting me in danger, don't be. I'm not exactly the kind of person anyone would see as a threat. That's precisely why I worry, Korak said softly. Your kindness. It makes you vulnerable. Ruby sat back, processing his words. She wasn't sure what to make of them, but she could sense the sincerity in his tone. Whoever Korak was, he carried a heavy burden, one she wasn't sure she fully understood. Still, she couldn't bring herself to push him away. If anything, his honesty only made her want to understand him more. Their conversation shifted after that, returning to lighter topics. Korak seemed relieved, though there was still a tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. As the rain continued to patter against the library windows, Ruby reached for a book she had been meaning to show him. "Here," she said, sliding it across the table. "This one's about a warrior who fights to protect his people, even when the odds are against him. I think you'd like it." Korak picked up the book, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he turned it over. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine gratitude. "I'll make sure to read it." The next few days passed uneventfully, but Ruby couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Korak seemed more cautious, glancing over his shoulder whenever someone entered the library. She could hear it in the way his voice tightened during their conversations, as if he were constantly on edge. It wasn't until the following week that she began to understand why. It was late in the afternoon, and the library was unusually empty. Ruby was engrossed in a new Braille novel when she felt it again, the shift in the air that always accompanied Korak's presence. But this time there was something different about it. The hum she had grown accustomed to was fainter, almost like it was being suppressed. She turned her head toward the sound of his footsteps, immediately noticing that they were heavier than usual. "Korak?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. "I'm here," he replied, but his voice was strained. Ruby frowned. "Are you okay? You sound different." There was a brief silence before he answered. "I'm fine," he said, though she could tell he was lying. "Just a long day." But Ruby wasn't convinced. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. His skin was warm, almost unnaturally so, and she felt the faint tremor of muscles tensed with effort. "Korak," she said firmly. "What's going on?" Before he could answer, the sound of the library door opening made them both freeze. Korak's entire body went rigid, and Ruby heard the faintest whisper of metal sliding against metal. She realized with a start that he was armed. The footsteps that followed were deliberate, echoing loudly in the otherwise silent room. Ruby's heart raced as she sensed the tension radiating from Korak. Whoever had entered, they weren't here to check out books. A voice, sharp and commanding, broke the silence. "Korak, surrender now, and we'll make this quick." Ruby's breath caught in her throat. The voice was unfamiliar, but its tone left no room for doubt it belonged to someone dangerous. She turned her head toward Korak, her mind racing. "What's happening?" she whispered. "Stay quiet," Korak murmured, his voice low and steady. "And don't move." The footsteps grew closer, and Ruby could hear the faint hum of something mechanical, perhaps weapons or armor. Her grip tightened on the edge of the table as fear coursed through her. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the voice said again, this time closer. "We know you're here. The bounty on your head is worth enough to retire on, so don't make us destroy this quaint little place to get you." Ruby's stomach churned. Bounty? Her mind reeled as she pieced together the fragments of their earlier conversations. Korak wasn't just running from enemies, he was being hunted, and now she was caught in the middle of it. "Go," Korak said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a side exit near the Braille section. You can slip out while they're focused on me." Ruby shook her head, her voice trembling. "I'm not leaving you." "You don't understand," Korak insisted, his tone more urgent. "If they find you with me, they won't hesitate to use you against me. Please, Ruby, go." Before she could respond, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and Ruby felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Then, without warning, a crash shattered the stillness as one of the library's shelves toppled over. Korak moved faster than she thought possible. She felt him step in front of her, shielding her with his massive frame. The air crackled with energy, and she heard the unmistakable sound of weapons being drawn. "Stay behind me," Korak said, his voice calm but commanding. Ruby clutched the table, her mind racing. She had no idea what was about to happen, but one thing was clear: Korak wasn't just a traveler or a curious stranger. He was something far more dangerous, and now she was part of his fight. The chaos erupted so suddenly that Ruby's breath caught in her throat. The crash of falling bookshelves reverberated through the library, followed by sharp, unfamiliar sounds that made her heart pound. They were mechanical and alien, like the whirring of energy weapons charging up. The air felt thick, charged with tension, and something primal that Ruby couldn't name. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Korak moved with a fluidity and precision that seemed impossible for someone so large. She couldn't see him, but she could feel the shift in the air as he positioned himself between her and the intruders. There was a faint hum, almost like a vibration, coming from him. It reminded her of the first time they met, but now it was sharper, more intense, as if his very presence had amplified. "Stay low," Korak instructed in a low, firm tone. "And don't move unless I tell you." Ruby nodded, her throat too dry to form words. She ducked beneath the table, her mind racing with questions and fear. Who were these people? Why were they after Korak? And what had he done to warrant such a violent confrontation? The answer didn't matter now. All that mattered was surviving. "Last chance, Korak," one of the intruders called out, their voice cold and mechanical, as if filtered through some kind of device. "Come quietly, and we'll spare the girl." Ruby froze, her pulse quickening. They knew she was here. Her mind screamed at her to stay hidden, but she couldn't stop herself from whispering, "Korak, don't let them hurt you because of me." There was a brief pause, and when Korak spoke, his voice was calm but filled with an edge she had never heard before. "If you want me, you'll have to go through me." The room erupted into chaos. The first blast of energy was so loud and bright that Ruby flinched, even though she couldn't see the light. The sound was sharp and piercing, followed by a low hum that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. She heard Korak move, his heavy footsteps quick and deliberate. The crash of something metallic hitting the ground made her heart jump. Korak's voice rang out, not in words but in a guttural growl that sent chills down her spine. It was a sound of defiance, primal and unyielding. The intruders responded with more energy blasts, each one accompanied by a high-pitched whine that made Ruby's ears ring. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was impossible to escape the sounds of the fight. Then, amid the chaos, she heard something unexpected: laughter. Deep and resonant, it was unmistakably Korak's. "Is that all you've got?" he taunted, his voice dripping with confidence. "I expected more from galactic bounty hunters." The reply was immediate and furious. The intruders unleashed a barrage of blasts, each one shaking the floor beneath her. Ruby felt the heat of the energy passing nearby and the acrid smell of something burning. She clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm, but the fear was overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away from this madness as possible, but she couldn't bring herself to leave Korak behind. "Ruby," Korak's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Move toward the back exit. Now. I'm not leaving you." She shouted back, her voice shaking but resolute. Korak didn't argue. Instead, she heard the sound of something heavy being thrown, followed by a loud crash and a muffled curse from one of the intruders. "Then stay low and don't move," he growled. The battle raged on, and Ruby could only sit helplessly beneath the table, her senses overwhelmed by the chaos around her. She tried to focus on Korak's voice, using it as an anchor in the storm. He moved with precision, each step calculated, each strike purposeful. The sounds of the intruders' weapons grew more frantic, their confidence clearly shaken. Then, suddenly, there was silence. Ruby's heart pounded in her chest as she strained to hear any sign of what was happening. The air was heavy with the scent of scorched metal, and something more organic that she couldn't quite place. She held her breath, waiting for Korak to speak, to tell her it was safe. But the silence stretched on, oppressive and unnerving. Korak? She called out tentatively, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm here, he replied, his voice calm but tinged with exhaustion. You can come out now. Ruby crawled out from under the table, her hands trembling as she reached for him. Her fingers brushed against his arm, and she immediately noticed the heat radiating from him. His skin felt like it was vibrating, an energy she couldn't explain coursing beneath the surface. Are you okay? She asked, her voice thick with worry. I'm fine, Korak said, though his labored breathing betrayed him. But we need to move. More will come. Ruby's stomach sank. More? How many are after you? Enough to make staying here a bad idea, he said grimly. Come on. He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle, and led her toward the back of the library. Ruby stumbled as they moved, her mind racing with questions she couldn't bring herself to ask. She could feel the tension in Korak's movements, the way he glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting an attack at any moment. When they reached the back door, Korak paused. Stay close to me, he said. No matter what happens, don't let go of my hand. Ruby nodded, her fear mingling with a strange sense of trust. Whatever Korak was hiding, she knew he would protect her. She felt it in the way he shielded her during the fight, the way he spoke to her with such care even amid the chaos. The door creaked open, and the cool evening air rushed in. Ruby shivered, the sound of distant sirens adding to her unease. Korak stepped outside first, his movements careful and deliberate. She followed, her hand still firmly in his. As they made their way down a narrow alley, Ruby couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every sound, every shadow seemed magnified, her heightened senses picking up on things she couldn't fully explain. She tightened her grip on Korak's hand, her voice barely a whisper. What happens now? Korak's reply was simple but filled with determination. We run. And with that, they disappeared into the night, leaving the quiet library and its shattered peace behind. But Ruby knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever Korak was running from, it had now become her fight too. And as terrifying as that thought was, she couldn't bring herself to regret meeting him. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was part of something bigger, something that mattered. And she wasn't about to let it go. The narrow alleyway stretched endlessly in front of them, the cool night air carrying with it the distant hum of sirens. Ruby stumbled as she followed Korak, her hand firmly grasped in his. He moved with a determined urgency, his strides long and deliberate. Ruby tried to match his pace, but the uneven ground and the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind made it difficult. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, but she didn't complain. She knew that whatever danger lay behind them was far greater than the discomfort she felt now. Korak, she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. Where are we going? Away from here, he replied, his tone grim. We need to find a place where they can't track us. Ruby's heart sank. The library had been her safe haven for so long, a quiet corner of the world where she could escape her reality. But now it was gone, torn apart by forces she still didn't fully understand. And Korak, this enigmatic being who had stepped into her life so suddenly, was at the center of it all. Yet, despite the chaos, she couldn't bring herself to regret meeting him. If anything, her resolve to stand by him had only grown stronger. The alley opened up into a dark, empty street. Korak slowed, his head swiveling as he scanned their surroundings. Ruby couldn't see him, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. His grip on her hand tightened, and she knew he was calculating their next move. They'll be looking for us, he said, more to himself than to her. We can't stay out in the open. Then where do we go? Ruby asked, her voice soft but steady. Korak hesitated. I have a contact nearby. Someone who might help. Ruby frowned. Might? It's complicated, Korak admitted. But right now, they're our best chance. Without waiting for her response, he guided her across the street and into another alley. The sounds of the city grew quieter as they moved further from the main roads, the distant hum of traffic replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of nocturnal insects. Ruby's other senses sharpened in the absence of sight, every sound and smell magnified. She could hear Korak's measured breathing, feel the warmth of his hand, and sense the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. After what felt like an eternity, Korak stopped abruptly. Ruby nearly collided with him, her fingers tightening reflexively around his. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're here," he said. Ruby tilted her head, listening intently. She could hear the faint hum of machinery, the soft buzz of what sounded like an electric generator. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal. It was clear they had reached some kind of industrial area, but she couldn't piece together what kind of help Korak expected to find here. He knocked on a metal door, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet night. There was a long pause, and Ruby felt her heart begin to race. What if this contact wasn't friendly? What if this was a trap? The door creaked open, and a voice gruff and wary spoke. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here, Korak." "I didn't have a choice," Korak replied evenly. "We need your help," the voice scoffed. "We?" Korak shifted slightly, positioning Ruby behind him. "She's with me. She's not part of this." Ruby bristled at the implication. "I'm right here, you know," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. The voice chuckled. "Well, she's got spirit, I'll give her that." There was another pause, and then the door swung open wider. "Fine. Come in. But if this brings trouble to my doorstep, you're both on your own." Korak led Ruby inside, his hand steady as he guided her over the threshold. The air inside was warm and smelled of metal and grease. She could hear the faint hum of machinery, the soft clink of tools being moved. Whoever this contact was, they seemed to work with their hands. The door shut behind them with a heavy thud, and the voice spoke again. "So, what mess have you dragged me into this time?" Ruby could hear Korak sigh. "The hunters found me. We barely made it out." "Barely," the voice repeated, a hint of amusement in his tone. "And now you've brought them to me." "No," Korak said firmly. "They're still searching the area. We need a place to lay low, just for a little while." The man grunted. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But if they find you here..." "They won't," Korak interrupted. "I'll make sure of it." Ruby listened to the exchange, her mind racing. She wanted to ask questions, to understand who this person was and why Korak trusted them, but she knew this wasn't the time. Instead, she stayed quiet, letting the two of them hash out their plan. After a long pause, the man sighed. "Fine, you can stay. But only for the night. After that, you're on your own." "Thank you," Korak said, his tone sincere. The man grumbled something under his breath, and then his footsteps retreated into another room. Korak turned to Ruby, his voice softer now. "It's safe here for now. You can rest." Ruby nodded, though she wasn't sure how much rest she would get. Her mind was still buzzing with everything that had happened, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead made it hard to relax. Still, she followed Korak as he led her to a small corner of the room, where a makeshift bed had been set up. "Who is he?" Ruby finally asked, her voice quiet. "An old ally," Korak said. "He doesn't trust easily, but he's good at keeping secrets." Ruby frowned. "And you trust him?" "I have to," Korak admitted. "He's one of the few people left who might still be willing to help me." Ruby lay down, her thoughts racing as she tried to process everything. She wanted to trust Korak, to believe that he knew what he was doing, but the danger they were in felt overwhelming. She had stepped into a world she didn't understand, one filled with enemies and secrets, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what was to come. As the hours passed, Ruby drifted in and out of sleep, her dreams filled with flashes of light and the sound of Korak's voice. When she finally woke, the room was silent, save for the faint hum of machinery. Korak sat nearby, his back to her, his posture tense. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice still heavy with sleep. He turned slightly, and though she couldn't see his face, she could hear the weariness in his voice. "I've been through worse." Ruby sat up, her resolve hardening. "What's the plan?" Korak hesitated before answering. "We leave at first light. There's a transport station a few miles from here. If we can get there, we can lose the hunters. And then what?" Ruby pressed. Korak was silent for a moment. "Then we figure out our next move." Ruby nodded, her mind made up. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with him. She didn't fully understand the path they were on, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to abandon him. Not now, not ever. As the first rays of dawn broke through the cracks in the walls, Korak and Ruby prepared to leave. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and unknowns, but they faced it together. For Ruby, it was a leap into the unknown, but for the first time in her life, she felt truly alive.